Welcome to the place of rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of our times. My name is Jonathan Boyce, and it's my pleasure to bring to you today's episode. Virginia and author Marilyn McEntyre discuss language and its impact on individuals and society. We hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Marilyn, on so many fronts, today's recording is no accident. Specifically, I am interested in you telling us about why caring for words in a culture of lies is imperative for emotional, spiritual, and physical health.
Well, I take it as an axiom of my faith and spiritual understanding that words are given to us as a gift. Words connect us to each other and to God. However we understand how we were created and made, it seems to me that being people who get to carry the responsibility of language has to be considered part of our human vocation. And it's always been the case to some degree that people in power generate propaganda machines. That's what happens. But it's never been so efficient or widespread or powerful as it is now, although the Nazi propaganda machine in World War II is an interesting precedent. Taking over public media is one of the things that happens when people in power are unchecked. And so it seems as though protection or care for language, in my book, Caring for Words, the analogy I used was caring for soil. Years ago, I heard a person who was in charge of the local community-supported agriculture give a talk. And he started by saying, if you had to name what you think of as the most pressing crisis facing the world now, what would it be? And people had lots of things to say, of course. And he said, well, all of those are plausible, but for me, I would say soil depletion. Because soil is living, and when it dies, nothing can grow in it. And that really struck me as a valuable image for what happens when words get used up or so twisted and distorted or flattened into slogans that they become unusable. And I think that's where we are, and I think that's where we've been for a while, partly because of the proliferation of media. Anyway, I wrote this book in 2009, so
wow,
it's gotten worse since then.
Yes, it has. The fruit of what you're saying basically is an enormous amount of confusion, chaos, and dis-ease in our intimate and personal lives. And at R.E.S.T, we're about displacing those things. So this notion of thoughts have power, but words have authority. And when we have a soil depletion problem, as you mentioned, and I love that analogy, we're in trouble because our health, literally our psychological health is predicated on displacing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease, and we employ words to do so. So anything that is an assault on that is just dangerous.
Yes.
You'd mentioned a list that a friend just sent you.
Yes.
Would you talk a little bit about that and share some of the words?
Yes. Let me just pull it up here. It was a list of words that have been recently banned or flagged in response to government mandates or to the mandates of DOJ, the current administration. I'm just getting this up now. I just want to give you the right source. This was from PEN America, so it's the Professional Association of Writers in the U.S. And it lists it as the federal government's growing banned words list. They say that there have been words that are banned by federal agencies and major newspapers or news outlets There are some that have been flagged, which is to say that if, for instance, the CDC, I know, has flagged certain words, and if they appear on, say, a grant application or a report, they have to go in and see the context to make sure that they're being used in an acceptable manner. And one of the things that I find most disturbing about this is how many agencies are voluntarily complying or self-censoring. One of the things that Timothy Snyder said in his very important little tiny book called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, in which he looks at how populations are taken over by authoritarian rule, is voluntary compliance. So his number one suggestion is don't obey in advance. And a lot of people here seem to be obeying in advance. They don't want to get in trouble, so they self-censor on the language they use. And I think, all of us have learned to self-censor in certain ways that are largely innocuous in social situations. And these days, I think most of us who are awake and not living under a rock understand that in public conversation, we have to be sort of careful about words that have become triggers.
That, and even the notion of self-censoring, I call it discernment and discretion and sensitivity and wisdom. Even the usage of the word self-censoring. Since when does being a clear thinking individual who make consents or not according to the dictates of their conscience, since exercising any kind of measure of discernment, since when is that now censorship? No, that's discernment, and that's wisdom. And what they call and what they use, we need to reject. That is not an appropriate way to communicate. Now we have to use their words.
Right.
You know what I mean? Is that censorship, or is that discretion? We need to encourage discretion and discernment. But to start using the words, it's almost like there's something, some intention, and it's almost sometimes existential in nature. It's bizarre how these trends and these rhythms develop, because even the word censor, it's almost like there's this drive to make everybody comfortable with something. So then we start misusing the language. And then before you know it, we demonize and create more confusion, chaos, and disease, because this is the buzzword to use now. You don't have a right to censor me. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I think that if I understand you correctly, it is to say that there's an important distinction between discernment and self-censoring. I think of self-censoring as something that is done out of fear.
Always.
I'm not going to use that word because it might get me in trouble. Whereas discernment and diplomacy and just kindness would suggest that you be sensitive to how language is going to be offensive, how it's going to maybe disrupt what you hope for as an open and honest conversation. How people are going to trip over those words. You don't want to throw stumbling blocks into the conversation. But I think it's important to be discerning and not self-censoring, and that means that itself takes some discernment.
It does. We make it very simple here. There's a language of liberty that established this republic and birthed a form of civil government unknown to man. And it's the preservation, the protection of people's individual liberties to secure freedom. Internal cause, external effect. The function of liberty is a function of the soul. People have to reconcile the confusion, chaos, and disease within themselves, and are given, not by government, but as a birthright, the capacity to exchange those ideas. And in exchanging those ideas, the fruit of that's what secures freedom. So we talk about everything as internal cause, external effect. And the reason I thought this call was providential is because I'm seeing the impact that this is having in working with a lot of trauma victims and a lot of first responders and general population, by the way. But there's no way to displace confusion, chaos, and dis-ease if you don't use the word language of liberty. Liberty is a language. In Spanish and French and Italian, there isn't two words. We have liberty and freedom in the United States because one is the effect, it's the result of the other. To your point of voluntary consent, well, that's a person's capacity to self-govern according to the counsel of their own will. And when we begin to dissect these words for them and help them understand the internal cause and external effect, it's just phenomenal what happens. All the covering, the hiding, and the blaming about everything and everybody all of a sudden starts immediately diminishing. So this concept of censorship, when did man make man God? And so when we understand what we call laws of nature and this self-evident truth is that there's a natural operating system within you that self-governs. You get a paper cut, the body does not consult you to start healing. It has an autonomic system and it heals itself. There's these other functions that are laws of nature as well. And one of them is this concept of liberty and freedom, right? So language is so important in understanding this. And of course, I have 150 words, but we got to go back to Noah Webster, 1828 dictionary, in my opinion, the father of the English language, to understand the distinction between these things. So what I found captivating about your list is I wonder what those censored words are, whatever that means. You can't censor me without me complying to that, which is your point and well taken. But I think what's really important is I want to invite our listening audience. No, you go to Noah Webster 1828 online dictionary. It is free, fully accessible to everyone. And then go and find the origin and the root cause of these words and say, wait, is this about an internal cause or an external effect? Because one is the language of things that are sacred, the inner workings of things that, right, in our soul that are navigated by our conscience, like our mind, our heart, our will, our conscience, and our feelings. Those are issues of liberty. Depending on what we do with those things, it secures or diminishes our freedom. And it's just a simple word for them to go and do work on. I think you're spot on in that we need to really become thoughtful of the words we're using and the impact and the consequence of them. Because I'm seeing the transformative. I said, no, I got to go back to language. I have to go back to words. So here's the language of everything that's secular, of sacred. It's going to come from the innermost working of your soul. Here's everything that's secular. That's going to be a function of your central nervous system, and it's going to speak to external things. So this concept of words is really, really important.
Yeah, although I think that the way I would nuance it is to say that language is always social. I mean, language evolves, and words that we use in one way now might have been used a different way in the 18th century. So I think of it as kind of floating on a river of language that's got a deep source in the gift of words to begin with to the human race. But it seems to me that the story of the Tower of Babel is to suggest that the scattering of human cultures into different language groups, however that historically played out and came about, has posed an ongoing challenge for the human race, that this is one of the things we have to deal with, that there are very few languages that translate one for one. There aren't any, really. Translation always involves really relational work, diplomatic work, trying to understand when you say that in Farsi or Spanish or Hindi, how do I render that in English? And I've done some translation work myself. It is poetic in the sense that you have a series of choices to make every time you choose a word. Different words just land differently. So I think each generation has to work this out
I agree.
with prayer and trust and love, the effort to stay in communities of trust and build communities of trust. That means staying in conversation.
Well, the letter of words and the spirit of words are different things as well. And there is this natural, innate capacity, being triune beings, having a spirit and a soul and a body, to really determine very quickly the things that give life and the things that extinguish life.
Right.
And fundamentally, I suppose that comes down to the concept of love. How do I love?
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps that's why Jesus said love was the greatest command. Right? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. So that internal dialogue we have with ourselves matters.
Yeah. And even when we put sentences together, the deep question behind speaking into the space between us is, what is the most loving thing to do?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it is confrontation and challenge. But I think that question is kind of the core question in all our transactions.
I'm curious what the banned words are. What are the first 5?
Well, they have them alphabetically listed.
Oh, did anyone catch your attention?
Well, I think some of them are predictable, but for instance, words like abortion and transgender and so on, you can understand that these are sort of target words for certain conversations. But there are other words like advocate or air pollution or biofuel. And so it seems as though they tend to be words that have come up in the context of contested bills that are before Congress, or practices or policies that for which they are key words. And so now it is an effort to identify what's happening every time you see one of those words. If you're talking about biofuels, what else are you talking about? Or carbon footprint, or even the word climate is on the list. And it's interesting, that just words like healthcare or climate, and certainly words that refer to partisan interests like Republican and Democrat become such triggers that it's difficult to have a conversation without pausing over the words themselves and saying, here's how I understand this, or here's how I'm using it in this instance, because they've been so battered by usage.
Words have been battered by usage, creating a bloodbath among the people that need the liberty to massage sometimes ideas and things, to express a thought.
Right.
And we're not very kind to each other, nor patient with each other, as we extend people the grace we need sometimes, and that is to flush an idea out. Mm-hmm. It might cause you great discomfort. It might make you very upset. But the fact is that I'm trying to find words, right?
Right.
What surprised you in writing your first book?
I was interested in looking at the ways, how can we maintain the integrity of the language we use? And as I looked at historical instances of people in conflict, I came upon a very interesting essay by George Steiner, who was a linguist and philologist. He spoke 15 languages himself. And he wrote an essay about what happened to the German language, not the German people, not the Jews, but what happened to the German language under the Third Reich. And he talked about how certain words became so embedded in the propaganda that was daily in front of people that their ordinary usage became impossible because they were so loaded. I think something comparable has happened even before the heightened political controversies we're seeing now, but I think something comparable has happened in commercial environments where if words are used enough times in commercials for products, they become associated with those products. and they become less usable for other purposes because that background noise is there when you use the word.
An imprint.
Yeah. And so one of the things I think that we need to help each other cultivate is the patience to pause here and there for a little moment of meta conversation, as I call it, to say things, to just flag the words themselves and say, and I know that I'm using a word here that's loaded, or I know that people understand this word a little differently. And here's how I see it, or here's how I hear it, or here's how I'm using it. Because otherwise, it's so easy to just go astray in public conversation because people will seize on words that they have different associations for. So attention to language itself is part of our responsibility now.
What are the words of the Third Reich?
He talked about how ordinary language got used up, not just words like Jude, which means Jew, because that, of course, was on right in front of everybody all the time. And it was associated with, horrific associations, like the word vermin was something that Hitler used to describe this whole population. But he also talked about very ordinary words like spritzen, which just means to spurt. And we have an English equivalent of that when we talk about spritzers. But it was used in a number of propaganda contexts in which it referred to the blood of the Jews would spurt from their veins. So he talks about how even a simple word that in ordinary times is an ordinary word becomes loaded with horrific association.
Yeah. What's the danger we face in America today? That we can just be cautious about not falling into the trends.
Yeah, I think that the degree to which we've normalized lies or distortions or oversimplifications in public conversation needs to be called out, and we need to be calling each other's attention to the fact that in many instances, what we're reading in media or hearing from very partisan sources needs to be examined in light of certain kinds of evidence. We like to think that we live in a culture of evidence, but it is very difficult to hold people to evidentiary standards when, in fact, so much public discourse is simply inflammatory and meant to oversimplify. Years ago, Ellen Goodman, who was a longtime columnist for the Boston Globe, came to speak at Mills College, where I was teaching at the time. And one of the things she said at the very end of her talk has stayed with me. She was talking about journalism and kind of trying to represent things truly, often in a short format. And she said, she looked at all the women and she said, the bottom line is always, it's not that simple. Which is to say, whatever you think you know, just pause over it long enough to ask yourself, what are the complicating factors? What is it I may not understand because of who I am, because of my social situation? And I don't mean to do that to a paralyzing degree, but I think that the danger of oversimplifying and reducing things to slogans makes it harder to think discerningly, to consider nuances, to say, there are some ways in which the opposite is also true, so to speak. But when people say there are two sides to every question, that always bothers me because there are actually 365 sides to any question. There are lots of ways of repositioning the question so that you're asking something a little different. And I know I'm sounding as though somehow there's an abstract academic standard we would all have to live up to, and I don't think that's true, but I think it's good to have little questions we keep asking ourselves, like what are the things I might be missing here?
We have to displace.
Can I afford to?
No, I appreciate what you're saying. We have to displace the confusion, chaos, and dis-ease within ourselves before we begin to insert ourselves in the public discourse, even privately, sometimes in relationships, we don't stop long enough to really ponder the implications
Right.
of the words we're using, but more importantly, of the things we're hearing and how we're processing. We don't ask people enough questions about what they're saying in
Right.
order to determine if we're defining words in the same way.
Right. In fact, I think that what do you mean and what do I mean are two of the most important questions we can hold on to in conversation. What do you mean is such an interesting question because immediately if someone asks you, you have to rephrase. You have to think of what's another way to put this. And that means that we have to come back to our own statements and say, what do I mean?
I think this notion of what do you mean, that is such a practical, and what do I mean?
Yes.
Is such a practical tool for people to consider.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a very simple word since yesterday was Mother's Day. I think of a simple word like family and how if I said, well, what do you mean by family? Do you mean the nuclear family? Do you mean extended families? How do you understand family? Family is often used as a metaphor for a workforce. And so I think that word itself, as self-explanatory as it may seem to be, gets used in a lot of different ways. So that's just one very simple example. And I think often on Mother's Day, which was yesterday, obviously we all know what mother means, but then mothering as a verb opens it up to all the ways you have been held and helped by people who offer the kind of protection and encouragement that mothers do. So I like expanding that word on Mother's Day to include women who may not be mothers, but do a lot of mothering.
And nurturing and caring and listening and supporting. So funny, I must have received 15 messages about that yesterday.
Interesting.
I know you're not my mother, but you've been that figure in my life.
Yeah.
What's something practical beyond what do you mean and what do I mean?
That we can do too.
That we can do.
Yeah, I think one thing is to really make sure that in whatever we write and in whatever extended conversations we have, that we just hold on to the idea that we are stewards of the gift of language. And that now and then we comment on words themselves. Oh, I like that word choice. Here's why. That word has been
affirmations,
important
right?
to me. Yes. Mm-hmm. Affirmations, noticings, help one another to notice when the language is being used beautifully, for one thing, and also when something is being oversimplified. To say, I think it might be more complicated than that. What do you think might be the complexities we'd run into? So just being willing to frame the next question, stay in the conversation, and not foreshorten the process of reasoning together.
Bottom line, kindness, thoughtfulness, self-control,
right,
and mindful about what's happening in you and what's happening and what the other person is trying to communicate.
Yeah,
see perhaps beyond, or wonder perhaps beyond what they're saying or how you're receiving what they're saying, and consider perhaps what they mean. And that's going to require curiosity, right?
Yes. And curiosity is a good cure for naivete or gullibility.
Yes.
I think there is such a thing as culpable ignorance. And so there's a certain amount of language about shrewdness in the Gospels. It's kind of a don't be stupid message. Look around, notice with each other and in conversation with your community of trust, what is happening around us. So I don't think any of us can do this alone.
No, and it's never been more important.
We hope listening to this episode has brought you closer to experiencing the freedom of wholeness and healing. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or for updates about R.E.S.T, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of R.E.S.T. If you would like more information about Virginia, or to support and join the cause of R.E.S.T, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to Rest with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.